My stepchildren used it on a Tuesday. They arrived at my home unannounced at 10:15 in the morning. They did not come alone. They brought a man in a charcoal suit holding a leather briefcase, whom they introduced with wide, practiced smiles as a senior cognitive specialist. They told me they had brought him here because they were just so worried about my memory. They wanted to evaluate my fitness to continue living alone in a 12,000 square foot estate. They wanted power of attorney. They wanted the keys to the kingdom. I did not scream. I did not order them out of my house. I asked the doctor how he took his tea. I poured 3 cups of Earl Grey from a sterling silver pot without spilling a single drop, and I sat in my wingback chair, perfectly still, while they attempted to strip me of my autonomy. Welcome back to Revenge Cold Stories. If you have ever been treated like a burden by people who are secretly waiting to inherit your life's work, this story is for you. Drop your first name and your city in the comments, and subscribe before we go any further. Now, let me take you back to before that Tuesday morning. I need to explain the architecture of my late husband's estate, because to understand the sheer, unadulterated greed of what my stepchildren attempted, you must first understand the mathematics of what they were trying to steal. My name is Margaret. I am 68 years old. I live in a stone manor in upstate New York, situated on 150 acres of manicured woodland. I was married to William for 24 years. William was a self-made industrialist who manufactured precision valves for commercial aerospace. When I met him, I was 38, working as a senior risk analyst for the private equity firm that was auditing his company. William was 52. He was brilliant with engineering and catastrophic with capital. I spent a year restructuring his corporate debt and saving his life's work from a hostile takeover. We fell in love in boardrooms and over spreadsheets. It was not a fiery, reckless romance. It was a partnership built on absolute, unshakable mutual respect. I understood the mechanics of his mind, and he trusted me with the architecture of his life. We married 3 years later. William had 2 children from his first marriage, David and Caroline. When I married their father, David was 19 and Caroline was 16. Their biological mother had passed away when they were young, and they had been raised largely by a procession of expensive nannies and the ambient privilege of William's checking account. From the day I moved into the estate, the dynamic was permanently fixed. To David and Caroline, I was the enemy. I was the gold digger. I was the interloper who had arrived to siphon off their inheritance. I never fought them on this perception. I simply went to work. Over the next 2 decades, while David failed out of 2 different business schools and Caroline funded 3 separate disastrous lifestyle boutiques with her father's money, I took over the management of William's personal wealth. I diversified his portfolio. I moved his heavy cash positions into municipal bonds, commercial real estate, and high-yield trusts. During our 24-year marriage, I grew William's net worth by 40%. I didn't steal their inheritance. I practically doubled it. William passed away 4 years ago from pulmonary fibrosis. His death was slow, brutal, and profoundly unfair. I cared for him at home. I managed his oxygen tanks, coordinated his hospice nurses, and held his hand in the quiet, terrifying hours of the night when the air in his lungs betrayed him. David and Caroline visited only when William's estate attorneys were present in the house. When the will was read, it was structured exactly as William and I had designed it. It was a standard, highly protective AB trust arrangement. Upon his death, the entirety of his liquid assets, the investment portfolios, and the estate itself transferred into a revocable living trust. I was named the sole trustee and the primary beneficiary during my lifetime. I had absolute control. I could spend it, invest it, or let it sit in the bank. David and Caroline were named as the remainder beneficiaries. This meant that whatever was left of the estate when I died would be split equally between them. They were guaranteed an inheritance, but they were legally barred from touching a single cent of it while I was still breathing and capable of managing my own affairs. William had structured it this way to ensure I would never be displaced from my home, and to protect his children from their own catastrophic financial instincts. David was furious. Caroline cried. They had both accumulated massive personal debts, living lifestyles they assumed would be entirely paid off the moment their father's heart stopped. Instead, they found themselves staring at a legal wall. They were heirs to a $30 million fortune, but they couldn't access it until the 64-year-old woman sitting across from them was in the ground. For the first 3 years after William's death, we maintained a cold, distant détente. We spoke on holidays. We exchanged brief, sterile emails regarding tax documentation. I continued to manage the trust, generating steady yields, living quietly with my 2 spaniels in the Stone Manor. But patience is a virtue that greedy people simply do not possess. The escalation began subtly, about 8 months before the ambush. It started with a phenomenon I can only describe as engineered gaslighting. Caroline began dropping by the estate unannounced. She had never done this before. She would arrive on a Sunday afternoon, bringing expensive, useless gifts, a cashmere throw, a box of artisanal teas, and she would talk to me with a cloying, suffocating sweetness. But during these visits, strange things began to happen. I would walk into the kitchen to find my reading glasses sitting inside the refrigerator. "Oh, Margaret," Caroline had sighed, gently taking the glasses out from next to the milk. "You must have set them down while you were making lunch. You really have to be careful. You're getting so forgetful lately." I hadn't put them there. I keep my glasses on a silver tray in the study. 2 weeks later, David came over for dinner. After he left, I woke up at 2 a.m. to the smell of natural gas. One of the burners on my Viking stove had been turned on, but not ignited. The gas was silently filling the kitchen. If I hadn't woken up to get a glass of water, it could have been catastrophic. David called me the next morning. "Margaret, the housekeeper told me about the stove. I'm so worried about you. Leaving the gas on? That's incredibly dangerous. At your age, living alone, things slip the mind." I didn't argue. I didn't accuse them of turning on the burner or hiding my glasses. I knew what they were doing. They were attempting to manufacture a narrative of cognitive decline. If they accused me of dementia outright, I could easily disprove it. But if they slowly built a documented history of concerning incidents, they could justify stepping in to protect me. Elder financial abuse rarely looks like a masked robbery. It usually looks like a loving child gently taking the checkbook away from a mother who is too tired to balance it. They needed me to be incompetent. If the sole trustee of a living trust is declared mentally unfit, the remainder beneficiaries can petition the probate court to step in, assume power of attorney, and take control of the assets. They were trying to drive me crazy, or at least make the world believe I already was. I responded to their gaslighting with absolute, chilling competence. I installed hidden security cameras in the kitchen and the hallways. I hired a private chef to handle the stove. I kept a meticulous, time-stamped journal of my daily activities. But David and Caroline were running out of time. David's leased Range Rover was reportedly facing repossession, and Caroline's third husband was currently being audited by the IRS. They could not wait for me to naturally decline. They needed the money now. Which brings us to the Tuesday morning ambush. When the doorbell rang, my housekeeper, Maria, answered it. She came into the sunroom where I was reading the Wall Street Journal. "Mrs. Sterling?" Maria said, looking deeply uncomfortable. "David and Caroline are here. They have a man with them." I carefully folded my newspaper. I placed it on the glass table. "Show them into the drawing room, Maria. And please, prepare a tray of tea." I walked into the drawing room. David was pacing in front of the fireplace. Caroline was sitting on the edge of the velvet sofa, looking tense. The man in the charcoal suit was standing near the doorway, holding a leather briefcase. He had the slick, over-groomed appearance of a man who makes his living in the gray areas of the law. "Margaret," Caroline said, jumping up and rushing toward me with an outstretched, dramatic hug. I allowed her to touch my shoulders, remaining as rigid as a statue. "To what do I owe the pleasure of a Tuesday morning visit?" I asked, my voice calm and perfectly modulated. David stepped forward, adopting his best performance of a deeply concerned son. He placed his hand over his heart. "Margaret, we need to have a serious talk. We've been talking, Caroline and I. We love you. Dad loved you. And we want to make sure you are safe." "I am perfectly safe, David," I said, My security system is top tier. We don't mean physical safety, Caroline interjected, her voice dripping with synthetic sorrow. We mean your mind, Margaret. The stove incident, the lost glasses, the times you've repeated yourself on the phone. We are terrified that you are experiencing early onset dementia. We don't want to see you struggle, David added smoothly. So, we've brought Dr. Aris. He is a premier neurologist and a cognitive specialist. We just want him to ask you a few questions, just a baseline evaluation, so we can get you the help you need. I looked at the man in the charcoal suit. Dr. Aris. I knew exactly who he was, though I had never met him. In the world of high-net-worth estate planning, there are always doctors who specialize in concierge evaluations. They are hired guns. Families pay them exorbitant retainers to conduct cognitive exams that magically yield whatever result the family is paying for. If they need a relative declared unfit to force a conservatorship, Dr. Aris would find the necessary cognitive impairments to justify a court filing. It was a brilliant, vicious trap. If I refused to take the test and threw them out, David would go straight to a probate judge. He would claim that his stepmother was exhibiting severe paranoia and hostility, classic symptoms of advanced dementia, and was refusing medical evaluation. He would request an emergency freeze on the trust assets pending a court-ordered medical review. If I took the test, Dr. Aris would twist my answers, document my hesitations, and write a medical report declaring that I lacked the executive function to manage a $30 million portfolio. They had cornered me in my own drawing room. Maria entered with the tea tray. She set it down with trembling hands and quickly left the room. I looked at the three of them. I did not show anger. I did not show fear. A baseline evaluation, I repeated softly. Just a few questions, Mrs. Sterling, Dr. Aris said, stepping forward, his voice patronizing and slow. It will be very simple. Nothing to be frightened of. I am not frightened, doctor, I said. I sat down in my wingback chair. I poured the tea. I handed a cup to Caroline, a cup to David, and left one on the tray for the doctor. If a conversation will put my stepchildren's minds at ease, I am happy to oblige. Please, ask your questions. Dr. Aris opened his briefcase. He pulled out a clipboard and a pen. He sat on the sofa opposite me. He began with the mini mental state examination. It is a standard tool used to assess cognitive impairment. It is designed to be simple. Mrs. Sterling, Dr. Aris said, speaking as if he were addressing a slightly deaf child. Can you tell me what year it is? It is 2026, I replied. Very good. And what is the current season? It is late autumn. Can you tell me where we are right now? What state and what county? We are in New York State, in Dutchess County, I said. I took a slow sip of my tea. Specifically, we are sitting in the drawing room of a property that is fully owned by the William Sterling Revocable Trust, of which I am the sole trustee. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Caroline looked at her tea. Dr. Aris made a note on his clipboard. Excellent. Now I am going to name 3 objects. I want you to repeat them back to me and remember them, because I will ask you to recall them in a few minutes. Apple, table, penny. Apple, table, penny, I repeated. The test continued for 20 minutes. I was asked to count backward from 100 by sevens. I did it flawlessly. Without pausing to breathe, I was asked to spell the word world backward. I did. I was handed a piece of paper and asked to draw the face of a clock, placing the hands at 10 minutes past 11. I took his pen. I drew a perfect circle. I placed the numbers with geometric precision. I drew the hands exactly where they belonged. I handed it back to him. Dr. Aris looked at the clock. He looked at my test scores. I had not given him a single millimeter of error to exploit. Now, Dr. Aris said, clearing his throat, what were the 3 objects I asked you to remember? Apple, I said. Table, penny. I set my teacup down on its saucer. It made a sharp, definitive click. And since we are testing memory, Dr. Aris, I continued, leaning slightly forward, perhaps you can remember the details of your medical license. Specifically, the formal reprimand you received in 2021 from the State Medical Board for providing highly subjective competency evaluations in contested probate cases, The room went entirely still. Dr. Eris's pen hovered over his clipboard. His smug, patronizing demeanor evaporated in an instant. I had read about him in a legal journal 2 years ago when I was auditing the trust's risk exposure. I make it my business to know the names of the mercenaries operating in my financial sector. I am a fully licensed practitioner, Dr. Eris stammered, his face flushing dark red. You are a liability, I corrected him sharply. I turned my gaze to David. David, did you honestly believe you could walk into my home with a rented doctor and strip me of my constitutional rights over a cup of Earl Grey? Margaret, you're being paranoid, Caroline cried, her voice rising in panic. This is exactly what we mean. You're acting hostile. We just want to help you. You want $30 million, I said, my voice dropping an octave, settling into the cold, heavy register of absolute authority. But you are not going to get it today. The test is over. You have your baseline. I am of sound mind, perfect memory, and supreme executive function. Now get out of my house. David stood up. His face was twisted with fury. The facade of the concerned son was completely gone, replaced by the entitled, enraged heir. This isn't over, Margaret, David sneered, pointing a finger at me. You think you're so smart, but you're old. You live alone. You're going to slip. And the moment you do, I am going to be standing in front of a judge with an emergency petition, and I am going to have you locked in a memory care facility so fast your head will spin. We have time. You don't? They stormed out. Dr. Aris followed them, snapping his briefcase shut and practically jogging to the front door. I sat in my wingback chair and listened to the heavy oak door slam shut. I listened to the sound of David's Range Rover tearing down the gravel driveway. I was alone in the quiet house. I was perfectly sane. I had won the battle. But as I sat there, looking at the cooling tea, I realized with terrifying clarity that David was right. They had time. I did not. I was 68 years old. I was healthy today, but biology is an undefeated adversary. If I suffered a stroke next year, if I fell and hit my head, if I developed a temporary cognitive fog from a simple medication interaction, David would instantly file the conservatorship. He would freeze the trust. He would isolate me, drug me in a facility, and drain my husband's legacy to pay off his debts. A medical defense was not enough. You can't fight a war of attrition against people who are waiting for you to die. I didn't need to prove I was sane. I needed to ensure that even if I lost my mind entirely, the money would remain completely, permanently out of their reach. I stood up. I walked past the drawing room, down the long hallway, and into my late husband's study. I opened the floor safe hidden beneath the Persian rug. I bypassed the legal documents, the deeds, and the domestic trust paperwork. I reached to the very back and pulled out a small black business card. It belonged to a man named Henrik. He operated out of Geneva. David and Caroline wanted to play a game of legal jurisdiction. They were about to learn that they were playing against a woman who understood international banking. To understand how to permanently disappear $30 million legally, you must first understand the vulnerability of the American probate system. The American legal system is not designed to protect the elderly from their children. It is a highly efficient machine designed to transfer wealth from the vulnerable to the legally aggressive. If David and Caroline successfully petitioned a judge for an emergency conservatorship, the court would freeze the domestic trust. A judge, looking at a forged or heavily biased medical evaluation, would strip me of my financial autonomy and hand my stepchildren the legal right to manage my assets for my own protection. They would have the legal authority to change the locks on my stone manor, put me in a managed memory care facility, and slowly liquidate my husband's empire to pay off their Range Rovers and failed boutique investments. A domestic legal defense is useless when the battlefield itself is rigged. You cannot fight a war of attrition against younger people who are simply waiting for your biology to fail. I didn't need a domestic defense. I needed an international fortress. I sat in my husband's study, staring at the small black business card. The name on it was Henrik von Kessler. Henrik was a senior wealth architect at a private boutique bank in Geneva, Switzerland. He did not handle tax evasion. He handled asset protection for ultra-high net worth individuals whose wealth was targeted by hostile litigation, corporate raids, or, in my case, predatory heirs. I picked up the phone. I did not use the landline. I used a prepaid mobile device I had purchased specifically for this transaction, ensuring the call records would never appear on my standard billing statements. Henrik answered on the second ring. Margaret. His voice was crisp, European, and completely devoid of unnecessary warmth. It has been several years since William's passing. I assume this is not a social call. It is not, Henrik, I said. I am currently the sole trustee and primary beneficiary of William's revocable living trust. I have full executive authority to invest, manage, and distribute the principal. My stepchildren are preparing to file a hostile conservatorship petition to seize control of the domestic entity. I see, Henrik said. The sound of a keyboard clacked softly in the background. They wish to weaponize your health. They do. I need to move the liquidity. All of it? He asked. Every single cent, I replied. The United States courts have exceptionally long arms, Margaret, Henrik noted, his tone turning analytical. If they secure a conservatorship, the judge will simply order you or your new legal guardian to repatriate the offshore funds. If the funds are held in a standard Swiss account, the international banking treaties will force us to comply with a U.S. court order. A simple offshore account will not stop them. I don't want a simple offshore account, I said, looking around the quiet, wood-paneled study. I want a Cook Islands Asset Protection Trust, and I want it governed by an anti-duress clause. There was a brief silence on the line. Then I heard Henrik exhale a slow, appreciative breath. You want to build a vault and throw the key into the ocean, Henrik said. Exactly. Let me explain what a Cook Islands Asset Protection Trust is, and why it is the absolute nightmare of the American legal system. The Cook Islands is a self-governing nation in the South Pacific. Decades ago, they wrote their trust laws specifically to protect wealth from foreign court orders. If you place your money in a Cook Islands trust, American judges have absolutely zero jurisdiction over it. But the true genius of the structure is the anti-duress clause, also known as a flee clause. If I set up the trust, I am the beneficiary. Henrik's firm in Geneva acts as the foreign trustee. Under normal circumstances, I can ask Henrik to send me money, and he complies. But if an event of duress occurs, such as a U.S. judge declaring me mentally incompetent and ordering my stepson to take over my finances, the anti-duress clause automatically activates. The moment David, acting as my court-appointed guardian, emails Henrik and demands the repatriation of the $30 million, the trust document legally binds Henrik to ignore the request. The clause explicitly states that any request made under court order, or by a guardian acting against my original competent wishes, is to be treated as an act of hostile duress. The money locks down. It cannot be moved. It cannot be accessed by the U.S. courts. It cannot be touched by David or Caroline. It remains safe, generating interest, completely outside the reach of the American probate system. It will take 4 months to properly structure the entity and clear the international compliance protocols, Henrik advised. You will need to liquidate the domestic assets quietly. If you move $30 million in a single wire transfer, it will trigger federal flags and your stepchildren might be alerted by the domestic bank managers. I am a risk analyst, Henrik, I said. I know how to structure a quiet liquidation. Then we will begin drafting the articles of incorporation, he said. Be careful, Margaret. You must remain legally, provably competent until the final wire clears. I will, I said, and hung up. The next 4 months were an exercise in extreme, calculated patience. Liquidating $30 million is not like emptying a checking account. The wealth was tied up in municipal bonds, blue-chip stock portfolios, and 2 commercial retail parks in New Jersey. I moved with absolute precision. I sold the retail parks to a private equity firm at a 5% discount in exchange for a quiet, all-cash closing and strict non-disclosure agreements. I liquidated the stock portfolios in calculated randomized tranches to avoid triggering automated alerts from my primary brokerage firm. As the cash pooled into the domestic trust accounts, I began wiring it to the Geneva holding accounts in staggered amounts. I did not change my lifestyle. I continued to drive my Mercedes to the local country club. I continued to pay my housekeeper Maria on time. I hosted a charity luncheon in my garden. To the outside world and to David and Caroline's private investigators, I was simply an elderly widow enjoying her twilight years in upstate New York. But behind the mahogany doors of the study, I was emptying the castle. There was only one problem remaining: the estate itself. The 12,000 square foot stone manor and the 150 acres of woodland were valued at approximately $8 million. You cannot wire a house to the South Pacific. Real estate is physically anchored in the jurisdiction of the United States. If David and Caroline secured the conservatorship, they would legally control the house. They could evict me, sell the property, and pocket the $8 million. I was not going to let them have the house. I contacted a commercial lender who specialized in high net worth leverage. Operating as the fully competent trustee, I took out a massive, aggressive home equity line of credit against the estate. I borrowed $7 million against the property. I took the $7 million in cash, and I wired it directly to Henrik in Geneva. I had effectively hollowed out the physical property. The domestic trust still technically owned the house, but the house was now encumbered by a massive, high-interest $7 million debt. If David and Caroline took the house, they would not be taking an asset. They would be taking a financial grenade. By the end of October, the transition was complete. The William Sterling Revocable Trust, which had held $30 million just 4 months prior, now held exactly $40,000 in a checking account, just enough to cover property taxes and basic living expenses for a few months. Every other cent was locked inside the Cook Islands Asset Protection Trust. The vault door was closed. Now, I needed them to try and break in. If I simply lived out the rest of my life in peace, David and Caroline would eventually inherit the offshore trust upon my death. I did not want them to inherit it. I wanted them to try and steal it while I was alive, so I could legally trigger the anti-duress clause and lock them out permanently. To trap a predator, you have to offer them a wounded animal. I needed to give them the medical event they had been waiting for. I began laying the bait in November. I fired my housekeeper, Maria. I gave her a generous severance and a glowing letter of recommendation, telling her I was moving to a smaller property. With the house empty, there were no witnesses to contradict the narrative I was about to build. I stopped answering my phone consistently. When David called, I would answer on the third try, and I would deliberately speak a fraction slower. I would ask him about his new Range Rover, knowing full well he had been driving it for 3 years. "Margaret?" David had asked during one of these calls, his voice tightening with predatory excitement. "Are you feeling all right? We talked about the car last week. Did we?" I murmured, sounding vaguely confused. "I suppose my mind is just elsewhere today." I started leaving my mail piled up in the driveway mailbox. I left the exterior lights of the manor on in the middle of the day. I knew David drove past the gates occasionally to check on the property. I was painting a masterpiece of neglect. The final trigger required absolute physical commitment. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early December. The temperature was freezing. I did not drink water for 18 hours. I allowed myself to become clinically, undeniably dehydrated. Dehydration in the elderly mimics the symptoms of severe cognitive impairment: confusion, lethargy, loss of spatial awareness. I called a taxi, not an ambulance. I told the driver to take me to the local grocery store. I walked into the produce aisle. I let my posture slump. I leaned heavily on the shopping cart. I deliberately bumped into a display of apples, knocking them to the floor. When the store manager rushed over to help me, I looked at him with wide, unfocused eyes. I don't know where my husband is," I said, my voice shaking perfectly. "William was just here." William had been dead for 4 years. The manager, looking deeply alarmed, guided me to a chair in the pharmacy waiting area and called for medical assistance. The paramedics arrived. They took my vitals, noted my severe dehydration and apparent acute confusion, and transported me to the local hospital. The hospital admitted me for observation and intravenous fluid replacement. Because I was admitted with altered mental status, The hospital administration immediately contacted my emergency contacts on file, David and Caroline. I lay in the hospital bed, a saline drip attached to my arm, staring at the sterile white ceiling. The physical discomfort of the dehydration was sharp, but the intellectual satisfaction was narcotic. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. They did not arrive that evening. They were too busy. They were busy contacting Dr. Aris. They were busy contacting their aggressive probate attorney. They were taking the hospital's admission report, which documented an elderly woman found wandering a grocery store looking for her dead husband, and attaching it to an ex parte emergency guardianship petition. An ex parte hearing means the judge hears the evidence without the defendant present. Because it was framed as a medical emergency, the judge reviewed the hospital report, reviewed Dr. Aris's sworn affidavit regarding my previous concerning behaviors, and granted a temporary emergency conservatorship. They had won. In the eyes of the state of New York, I was no longer a competent adult. I was a ward of the state, and David Sterling was my legal guardian. They arrived at the hospital at 10 a.m. on Thursday morning. I was sitting up in bed, fully hydrated, reading a hardcover biography of Catherine the Great. My mind was perfectly sharp. The temporary confusion from the dehydration had vanished hours ago. The door to my private room opened. David walked in first. He was holding a thick manila folder. Caroline followed close behind, her face trying to maintain an expression of sorrow, but her eyes were glittering with absolute, unrestrained triumph. "Hello, Margaret," David said. His voice had changed. The synthetic concern was gone. He was speaking to me the way a warden speaks to an inmate. I closed my book and set it on the tray table. "David, Caroline, how kind of you to visit." "We aren't just visiting," Caroline said, crossing her arms. She looked around the small, sterile room with a look of immense satisfaction. "We are here to take care of you." David stepped up to the side of the bed. He dropped the manila folder onto my lap. "That is a court order signed by a Dutchess County probate judge," David said, his voice cold and commanding. "It grants me full emergency legal guardianship over your person and your finances. The court has declared you unfit to manage the William Sterling Revocable Trust." I looked at the folder. I did not touch it. I looked up at David. "A court order?" I repeated softly. "Yes," David sneered, the resentment of 24 years finally bleeding out. "It's over, Margaret. You are done. I have already contacted the primary domestic brokerage and frozen the trust accounts. By this afternoon, I will be legally instated as the sole managing trustee. You are going to be transferred from this hospital to a managed memory care facility down in the valley. Caroline and I will be taking over the management of the estate. We are going to list the house next week," Caroline added, unable to hide her greedy smile. "It's much too big for you anyway. You need round-the-clock supervision." They had it all planned out. They were going to lock me in a nursing home, sell my home, and drain the portfolio. They thought they were the architects of a brilliant, flawless coup. I reached out and adjusted the blanket over my knees. I looked at the two of them. I did not look frightened. I did not look confused. I smiled. It was a small, chilling smile. The kind of smile a spider gives a fly that has just stopped struggling in the web. David frowned. The smile unnerved him. It did not fit the narrative of the confused, declining old woman he thought he had trapped. "Did you call the domestic brokerage this morning, David?" I asked smoothly, my voice ringing with the absolute, crystal-clear authority I used to command boardrooms. David hesitated, thrown off balance by my sudden lucidity. "Yes, I sent them the court order. They are locking you out. Did you ask them for the current account balances?" I asked. David blinked. "The freeze takes 24 hours to fully reflect the asset transfers into my name. But I know the valuations. The portfolio is worth $30 million. "The portfolio," I corrected him gently, "was worth $30 million 4 months ago. If you had asked the domestic brokerage for the balance this morning, David, they would have told you that you have successfully seized control of exactly $42,000. The room went dead silent. Caroline's arms uncrossed. "What are you talking about?" "I am talking about the fact that you are too late," I said, leaning back against the hospital pillows. "The William Sterling Revocable Trust has been functionally empty since October. I liquidated the municipal bonds. I sold the commercial parks. I sold the stock portfolios. You have spent thousands of dollars on lawyers and fake doctors to seize control of a checking account that barely covers the landscaping bill. David's face flushed a deep, dangerous crimson. You're lying. You couldn't have moved that much money without triggering a tax audit. It's in the domestic trust. It isn't, I said. And you will find out very shortly that the estate you plan to list for sale next week has a $7 million commercial lien against it. I took out a massive equity line against the house. If you want to sell it, you have to pay the bank $7 million first. You didn't inherit an estate, David. You inherited a mortgage. Caroline looked at her brother, sheer panic radiating from her face. David, where is the money? What did she do? David grabbed the rails of my hospital bed, leaning over me, his breath hot and furious. Where is it, Margaret? If you hid the money in a shell company, I will use this court order to tear your life apart. I am your legal guardian. I have the legal right to repatriate every single cent you moved. You do, I agreed softly. You have the absolute legal right to ask for it back. I reached over to the bedside table. I opened the small drawer and pulled out a single sheet of heavy, watermarked Swiss paper. But you see, David, I whispered, handing him the paper. Asking for it back is the exact mechanism that locks you out forever. David snatched the sheet of heavy, watermarked Swiss paper from my hand. He read the letterhead first. Von Kessler Wealth Management, Geneva, Switzerland. He frowned, his eyes darting down to the body of the text. Caroline leaned over his shoulder, her manicured fingers gripping his suit jacket, trying to read the legal phrasing that was entirely foreign to her. What is this? David demanded, though his voice had lost its commanding edge. A Cook Islands Asset Protection Trust? Margaret, I have a New York State court order. It supersedes whatever offshore shell company you tried to build. A U.S. federal judge will order the repatriation of these funds immediately. You clearly have not read the specific mechanics of a Cook Islands trust, David, I said, leaning back into my hospital pillows and folding my hands neatly in my lap. Allow me to explain it to you. It will save you hundreds of thousands of dollars in useless legal billing. I looked at him with the patient, clinical expression of a teacher explaining a very simple math problem to a very slow student. When I established the trust, I said, I included an anti-duress clause. In international banking, it is colloquially known as a flee clause. The trust is managed by my foreign trustee, Henrik. Under normal circumstances, I can ask Henrik to disperse funds and he complies. But the anti-duress clause dictates that if an event of duress occurs, Henrik is legally, irrevocably bound to ignore any and all instructions to move the money. David stared at me. He was beginning to understand the shape of the trap, but he hadn't yet realized that his foot was already bleeding inside the steel jaws. And what constitutes duress? Caroline asked, her voice trembling. I smiled. A court order from a United States judge declaring me mentally incompetent and appointing a hostile financial guardian. That is the exact definition of an event of duress. I pointed at the manila folder sitting on my bed. By going to that judge, I continued softly, by presenting false medical documents and securing that emergency conservatorship, you did not gain control of my money, David. You permanently locked it down. The moment you email that court order to Geneva to demand the funds, Henrik will legally identify it as an act of duress. He will ignore your emails. He will ignore your phone calls. He will ignore the New York probate judge. The $30 million is locked in the South Pacific, entirely out of the jurisdiction of the American legal system. And you are holding the very document that ensures you can never, ever touch it. David's face went entirely slack. The heavy manila folder slipped from his grip and fell onto the hospital floor with a dull, pathetic slap. You set us up, David breathed, stumbling backward a single step. You set yourselves up, I corrected him. If you had simply possessed the patience to wait for my natural death, the remaining principal of the trust would have passed to you and your sister cleanly. You were guaranteed an inheritance. All you had to do was nothing. But your greed made you aggressive, and your aggression triggered the exact legal mechanism designed to destroy you. We will sue! Caroline shrieked, tears of sheer panic spilling over her eyelashes. We will drag you into federal court. We will claim you committed fraud. With what money, Caroline? I asked, tilting my head. Litigating an international trust requires retaining offshore counsel. It requires millions of dollars in upfront legal fees. Your third husband's bank accounts are currently frozen by the IRS. David's car is a week away from repossession. You do not have the capital to fight a $30 million offshore entity. I turned my gaze back to David, who was staring at the floor, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. And let us not forget your new responsibilities, David, I added brightly. You are now my court-appointed financial guardian, which means you are legally responsible for managing the debts of the domestic estate. That includes the $7 million commercial lien I took out against the manor. David's head snapped up. The first quarterly balloon payment is due in 3 weeks, I said. The domestic trust only holds $42,000. Since you cannot access the offshore funds, the domestic trust will default. The commercial lender will foreclose on the estate. They will seize the house. They will evict you, and they will liquidate the property. You thought you were inheriting a kingdom, David, but all you did was sign up to be the captain of a sinking ship. The silence in the sterile hospital room was absolute. It was the sound of complete, generational ruin. David didn't scream. He didn't threaten me. He turned around, grabbed the door handle, and walked out of the room without saying a single word. Caroline stood there for a moment, looking at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror, before turning and fleeing into the hallway after her brother. I picked up my biography of Catherine the Great, found my page, and continued reading. The next 48 hours unfolded exactly as my risk models had predicted. David, desperate and panicked, hired an aggressive domestic litigator on credit. His lawyer immediately sent the New York court order to Henrik in Geneva, demanding the repatriation of the $30 million. Henrik, operating with the cold precision of Swiss banking law, replied with a single 2-paragraph email. He formally acknowledged receipt of the court order, legally identified it as an event of duress under the trust's foundational charter, and formally refused the repatriation request. David's lawyer attempted to petition the New York judge to hold the foreign trustee in contempt. The judge granted the order, but an American contempt charge is utterly useless against a citizen of Geneva managing a trust in the Cook Islands. International law is not a polite suggestion. It is a brick wall. The U.S. court had absolutely zero enforcement power. While David was hemorrhaging borrowed money trying to fight an unwinnable international war, my own legal team made their move. I had not retained a local probate lawyer. I had retained the most ruthless, expensive appellate firm in Manhattan, funded by a direct, legal disbursement from my Cook Islands trust that bypassed the frozen domestic accounts entirely. My attorneys arrived at the hospital on Friday morning. They did not come alone. They brought a panel of 3 independent, board-certified neurologists from Mount Sinai. By this time, my clinical dehydration had been completely resolved by the intravenous fluids. I sat in a conference room in the hospital and underwent a grueling 4-hour cognitive battery test. I answered every question perfectly. I drew the clocks. I recited the sequences. I demonstrated flawless executive function and spatial awareness. The neurologists issued a joint, sworn medical affidavit stating that I possessed 0 signs of cognitive decline, dementia, or Alzheimer's. They documented that my temporary confusion in the grocery store was the direct, singular result of acute dehydration, a highly common and easily reversible medical anomaly. On Monday morning, my Manhattan legal team marched into the Dutchess County Courthouse. They filed an emergency motion to dissolve the temporary conservatorship. They presented the Mount Sinai affidavits. And then, they presented the real weapon. My attorneys filed a formal complaint with the state medical board against Dr. Harris. We submitted the hidden security camera footage from my drawing room, proving that Dr. Harris's baseline evaluation had been entirely fabricated to suit the narrative of the heirs paying his retainer. Faced with the loss of his medical license and potential criminal fraud charges, Dr. Harris panicked. He immediately retracted his sworn affidavit, claiming he had been misled by David and Caroline regarding my medical history. Without the fabricated medical evaluation, David's entire legal foundation vaporized. The judge, furious at having been manipulated into signing an emergency ex parte order based on perjured medical testimony, dissolved the conservatorship immediately. He restored my full legal autonomy, reinstated my control over the domestic trust, and issued a blistering formal sanction against David and his legal counsel. The entire coup had lasted less than a week. I was officially, legally sane. The temporary duress was lifted. I walked out of the hospital on Tuesday afternoon, wearing my cashmere coat, and climbed into the back of a black car my attorneys had arranged. I did not go back to the Stone Manor. The manor was a lost cause, and I had no interest in living in a house tainted by their greed. Instead, I drove to the airport. The fallout for David and Caroline was catastrophic. Because I had formally regained control of the domestic trust, the responsibility of the $7 million commercial lien technically reverted to me, but I had engineered the debt strategically. I simply allowed the domestic trust to default. I refused to make the balloon payment. The commercial lender initiated foreclosure proceedings. Because the debt was held by the LLC and structured as a non-recourse loan, the bank could only seize the collateral, the house itself. They could not touch my offshore wealth, and they could not attach the debt to me personally. David and Caroline had to watch as the bank seized the William Sterling estate. The 12,000 square foot stone manor, the 150 acres of woodland, the legacy they had believed was their birthright, was auctioned off to a luxury resort developer to cover the debt. David's leased Range Rover was repossessed 2 weeks later. Without the illusion of his father's estate to prop up his credit, his personal creditors closed in. He filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy before the end of the year. Caroline's husband was formally indicted for tax evasion. Because Caroline had co-signed his fraudulent returns, her boutique assets were seized by the federal government. She moved into a rented 2-bedroom apartment in Queens. They got exactly what they deserved. They got nothing. 6 months later, I was sitting on the terrace of a villa overlooking Lake Geneva. The air was crisp and smelled of pine and fresh water. Henrik von Kessler sat across from me at the wrought iron table, sipping a double espresso. Because the U.S. court order had been permanently dissolved and my legal competence was restored, the event of duress was officially over. I had instructed Henrik to dissolve the Cook Island structure and repatriate the funds directly into a secure Swiss holding account under my sole, unencumbered control. "The final wire has cleared, Margaret," Henrik said, placing a discreet leather folder on the table. $32 million, accounting for the interest yields over the last 2 quarters. It is entirely yours. "Thank you, Henrik," I said. "Your stepchildren," Henrik noted, his tone conversational but laced with professional curiosity. "Did they attempt to contact you?" "David left 3 voicemails last month," I replied, looking out over the glittering blue surface of the lake. "He apologized. He said he had been misguided. He asked if I could find it in my heart to issue a small stipend from his father's legacy to help him cover his legal fees." "And your response?" "I deleted the voicemails," I said simply. "I am a risk analyst, Henrik. I do not invest capital into failing assets." Henrik smiled a small, rare smile. "Indeed." I picked up my tea. It was perfectly steeped. I took a sip and watched the sailboats drift across the water, enjoying the profound, unbreakable peace of a woman who had successfully defended her kingdom by moving the entire castle. That is the whole story. Now here is what I want to leave you with. We are taught to believe that family is an absolute bond, a tether that requires endless forgiveness and infinite patience. We are taught that as we age, we must gracefully step aside and hand the reins to the next generation, trusting that they have our best interests at heart. But trust is not a mandatory inheritance. It is a calculated risk. When people look at you and see an expiration date, they stop treating you like a human being. They start treating you like an obstacle standing between them and their entitlement. They will use your age against you. They will use your kindness against you. They will use the legal system, designed to protect you, as a weapon to destroy you. Do not let them. You do not need to raise your voice. You do not need to argue with people who are committed to misunderstanding you. True power is not loud. True power is a perfectly drawn clock. True power is a quiet wire transfer. True power is recognizing the trap they are trying to push you into, stepping aside, and watching them fall into it themselves. If someone is waiting for you to die so they can live, it is your absolute right to take your life's work, lock it in a vault, and throw the key into the ocean. Let them inherit exactly what they earned. Tell me in the comments your first name and your city. Tell me if you have ever had to protect yourself from the people who were supposed to be protecting you. For more stories like this one, come find us on the channel. Every story here is about someone who refused to be a victim and decided to be the architect of their own survival. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.